When the Light Returned to Main Street is a book written by my husband, Jeff Hampton. It's a compilation of Christmas short stories. One of my particular favorites is Away to the Manger, and I want to share it with you. There was a sharp chill in the air on this Saturday evening as the old wise man stepped outside to check the weather. Glad I wore my long johns, he thought, and then stepped back inside the church to climb into his robe and crown. Nearby, 10 other wise men and one wise woman were making similar preparations. 12 in all, because the 4 downtown churches were presenting their annual living nativities this night, and one was a woman, because the progressive folks at New Spirit Congregation believed there must have been a woman among the 3 kings for them to have found that Christ child those 2,000 years ago. What was less certain at New Spirit, or with anyone else, was why the town of just 5,000 souls needed 4 downtown churches and a few others on the fringes. Some allowed that it was because the earliest settlers came as immigrant groups and held closely to their languages and traditions. But now, in the 21st century, the old countries had been long forgotten, and everyone in town spoke the same language, ate the same food, and cheered for the same high school football team. Yet the Sunday divisions persisted, and so it was that the 4 churches that were nestled together within 8 square blocks had their own Christmas celebrations, including living nativities. What started at one church a dozen years earlier had escalated into an annual competition as one congregation after the other presented their version of that most familiar of biblical tableaus. The competition was mostly friendly, with the 4 churches initially drawing lots to see who would go first over the 4 weekends of Advent. But that provoked the ire of a particularly powerful businessman and deacon at one of the churches who said the drawing of lots was nothing short of gambling. So that was changed to a rotation of the order each year. In that way, each church got a chance to be the first to show off its pageantry, while the others could try to outdo them based on what had been presented. Which worked out fine until this year, when the 4-week schedule was thrown off by an unusually busy civic calendar. With the first 3 weekends of December overtaken by the downtown tree lighting, Miss Pomegranate's junior players' staging of the Nutcracker, and a free screening of White Christmas at the Odeon Theater, all that was left for the churches was the Saturday night before Christmas. "It's gonna be head-to-head," said the pastor of the Fellowship Church, who 40 years earlier had quarterbacked the Rattlers to the state 2A football championship and still decorated his sermons and prayers with sports talk. "We're going to need a solid game plan and a few surprise plays to beat those other teams. Those other fine churches." It might have been said differently at the other churches, but the competitive spirit was running just as high. They convened their committees and made their plans for the most spectacular live nativity that had ever been conceived in the town, or in the county for that matter. But while the fellowship pastor might have said, "We're ready for whatever they throw at us," he failed to remember that sometimes the biggest surprises on game night come not from blitzing defenses, but from the unexpected places like the grandstands. Just hours before the nativities were set to go live, the chairwoman at Grace United got a call from her Holy Family. The Christ child was colicky and would not be available. Shaken but not deterred, the chairwoman pulled the church directory from her desk drawer and began thumbing quickly through the pages as her committee stood by. Stopping at the photo of a young couple that were newlyweds just last year, she called them, but was told their 8-month-old boy couldn't sit still and they wouldn't force him. "We're free-ranging him," said the mother. And when asked what that meant, she explained that if the boy started to crawl, they were bound by modern developmental science to let him crawl. It's his best chance of self-actualizing who he wants to be. "Well, we can't have the baby Jesus just crawling away from the manger," said the chairwoman. "What about that couple with the sweet little baby girl?" asked a committee member. "She's a girl," said the chairwoman. "So?" She's pink and bald, and she'll be wrapped in swaddling clothes. Who's going to know? God will know, snapped the chairwoman. She looked at the clock and the nativity players who had assembled. I think we're done. We can't go on without a proper Christ child. There was silence and the heavy weight of disappointment in the room until a local handyman snapped his fingers loud enough to make several people jump. A light, he said. Huh? Said the chairwoman. Instead of a baby, let's symbolize the presence of the Holy Child and God's redeeming spirit with a light. The idea circled the room and heads nodded both for and against until a call was made to the senior pastor, who affirmed that a light would be a theologically acceptable representation. So the handyman went out to his truck, fished through his toolbox, and pulled out extension cords, mounts, and the precious Holy Child in the compact form of a 150-watt outdoor flood lamp. The lamp was bracketed deep inside the manger and surrounded by white linen. When the signal was given, the extension cord was plugged in and everyone fell silent as radiant beams of heavenly sunshine were thrust upward through the dusty air beneath the arched stable that had been built entirely of hay bales. Beautiful, crowed the chairwoman. Now turn it off until we're ready. We don't want to show our hand too soon. When the committee at Grace United went back inside to get into costume, there were sighs of relief across the street at Second Missionary Temple, where a pickup truck rattled into the parking lot pulling a trailer. They had their own nativity crisis a few days earlier when their regular sheep supplier was caught rustling. All of his herd, his and the alleged rustled sheep, were in quarantine at the county feedlot until they could be sorted out. So a member of their committee, a straight-talking lawyer who was known for getting things done, took to the internet and phone and within a few days found a dozen sheep. Now, these aren't fluffy white sheep like you see in Bible storybooks, said the handler over the phone. These are short-haired exotics, and they're white, apricot, and black. You still want them? We have no color preference. We are a welcoming and diverse community of people and sheep, said the lawyer. He wasn't about to say no when he'd heard that Fellowship Church had something new up their robes. And besides, Second Missionary Temple had a tradition of having live animals, and this year wasn't going to be any different. After the sheep had been unloaded and corralled behind the short fence that formed the front of the stable, the handler looked at his watch. Back at 10 o'clock to round them up. The lawyer held out his arm to stop the man. Where do you think you're going? To the cafe on Main Street for some coffee and pie. No, you don't. The rental fee was for the sheep and for you. Well, I don't think you really need me because, yes, we do need you on account of the city code says sheep can't be left unattended downtown, and nobody here knows anything about sheep. Now, if you want to donate your fee, I'm sure we could find someone. No, I didn't come all this way in the cold to not get paid. That's the spirit. The lawyer slapped the handler hard on the back. It'll be easy. We've got a costume, a shepherd's crook, and a thermos of coffee for you. With that resolved, the handler was given his costume, and that's when the trouble began. He was putting the heavy red and brown robe on over his jeans and jacket when his Purina ball cap got stuck in the head hole. He raised his hands up to pull himself through, but a gust of wind got all that red and brown fabric to flapping, throwing him off balance and tottering toward the stable. The sheep, which had been standing quietly and sweetly, saw this headless being coming toward them and went into a panic of churning and baying behind the fence. Hearing their distress, the headless handler groped his way toward the flock, but stumbled and fell face down through the fence. The anxious sheep ran across his back and out through the breach. Led by a large black ram, the flock rumbled in a calico wedge through the churchyard and out into the dark street, where they dodged honking cars until they were attracted by the welcoming glow of Grace United's 150-watt Christ Child, which had just been turned on again. The sheep were nosing around, inspecting the accommodations as the holy parents and shepherds came out to take their places. When the sheep looked up, they panicked again at the sight of more robed beings, and they bolted for the exit, turning over the manger and the light. There was a crackle and a pop, and then the dry hay burst into flame. "Call 911," shouted a shepherd to a wise man who dug through his robe for his cell phone. Before he finished the call, the siren could be heard from the volunteer firehouse 10 blocks away. The truck arrived a minute later, but the hay stable burned big and fast. One of the firemen told the newspaper it went up like a Viking funeral pyre, and there was nothing they could do but soak the ground around it. The sheep, meanwhile, had darted to the next corner and across the street to New Spirit Congregation, which didn't have a wooden stable or a haystack, but instead had a large sports tailgate canopy that was wrapped in canvas and painted to look like stone, following the belief by some that the stable might have actually been a cave. The Holy Family there had already attracted a small number of viewers, and anticipation was keen as Joseph stood above the manger and said, "Who's this that comes? Could it be lowly shepherds?" He pointed stiffly toward the east, and the crowd turned. But instead of seeing 2 shepherds, a shepherd boy, and a dog coming to kneel before the manger, what they witnessed was a dozen sheep racing toward them, followed by a dozen shepherds and wise men with their robes flapping behind them. The sheep streamed through the canopy at full speed, baying and bleating loudly, and the quick-thinking virgin plucked her baby out of harm's way just before the manger was trampled by a careening ewe. The flock raced off into the darkness once more, with the shepherds and wise men from Grace United and Second Missionary joined by their brothers and sisters from New Spirit. The next stop on the Nativity tour was the Fellowship Church, which had not yet manned its nativity, an open-air setting with bleachers barred from the Parks Department. The searchers came to a stop there, and everyone was looking around when an angel, robed in a white wedding gown and fixed with translucent butterfly wings, buzzed into view on a zip line and heralded the news. "Lo, be not afraid, they have gone yonder," and pointed with outstretched arms down the street into the quiet of the neighborhood. The growing host of searchers moved with haste, some gathering up their elaborate robes so as not to tear the hems with their Nikes and Adidas, and coming to the next corner, they stopped. A contingent of wise men stepped forward, led by the wise old man who was wearing long johns and who had retired some years earlier from the police department. He held up his hand and let out a loud "shh," which was passed back through the ranks of shepherds and holy families and everyday people who had joined the search. Everyone stood quietly and listened until the silence was broken by the faint cry of a lamb. "This way," whispered the old wise policeman, and the crowd that had grown to almost 100 now walked and stopped, until they followed the sound to a dark, vacant house. Looking down the driveway, they saw the sheep standing quietly and watchfully at the entrance of an open garage. And from inside the dark garage came the unmistakable sound of a cooing baby. The old wise policeman pulled a small flashlight out from under his robe, switched it on, and cast its beam up the driveway, past the sheep, and into the garage. There, huddled among the debris of the long-abandoned residence, was a young couple, kneeling beside a wooden crate in which they had created a makeshift cradle. The young man leaned forward to shield his wife and child from the light and from the unknown intentions of the throng that stood outside. Whispers floated through the crowd. "Who are they?" And "What do we do?" But then someone began to sing, "Away in a Manger," and the song spread back through the costumed nativity players and the people. A pair of little girl angels from Grace United and Fellowship Church, who were schoolmates at the primary school, gamely plucked the melody on little harps that they clutched. The music was picked up by the wind and carried downtown, where shoppers on the square later claimed to have heard it, some even believing it might have come from heaven itself. The sheep handler, who had never gotten into his robe but had not turned loose of the thermos, brought it forward and handed it to the young father, and then stepped back and knelt among the sheep that gathered quietly at his side. A woman who had been carrying a box of warm cookies for a post-nativity party handed it gently to the young mother. Likewise, a fireman who attended to the flames at Grace United came forward with his heavy coat and wrapped it around the cradle. "What's this?" The question came from a voice next door, and the people turned to see the back screen door of the neighboring house open and an elderly couple come down the steps. They were directed through the crowd to the family, and when they saw them, the older woman held out both her hands and said, "Come." The young parents gathered their child, a suitcase, and the gifts, and followed the old couple up the steps and into the warmth of their home. Before following them inside, the old man turned to the crowd and spoke from a tradition he had known long ago. "The peace of the Lord be with you." The sign of peace was passed from person to person, and then the robed shepherds and the handler with his flock, the wise men and women, the angels of all ages, the firemen and the church committee leaders, and the townspeople who had come to view all the living nativities began walking back to their churches and homes. Before saying goodnight, members of the 4 committees stood in the street outside their churches and agreed that next year, and from then on, they would put all their energy into just one live nativity. "We'll have that floating angel for sure," said one as they turned to go to their respective churches. "That was the best thing ever." "And we'll start lining up those babies as soon as they hatch," said another. "We need more depth in the lineup." "And sheep. Gotta have those sheep. And plenty of real shepherds," said yet another. In the quiet of an upstairs room in the house down the street, the young parents looked down at their new baby tucked snugly into a crib that had been pulled down from the attic. The mother said not a word, but she kept what had happened and pondered it in her heart.